In which case, I'll just leave it to James. Is going to chair our next session. I'll let you introduce it.
Thank you very much. Well, everyone, welcome to session 2, which is normally about the spatial and the archaeology. But as with many of our sessions, there's going to be so much overlap in themes that we can discuss and talk about. So, well, without further ado, would the panel like to introduce themselves, please? Alfred.
I'm Alfred Hawkins. I am curator of historic buildings for the Tower of London and the Banqueting House with Historic Royal Palaces, and I am cathedral archaeologist at Portsmouth Cathedral, so a particular interest in church chapels, royal peculiars, and the practical side, as well as policy and how we curate those stories and share the information that we get from archaeological work.
My name is Sue Evans, and I'm working with the St Asaph Diocese on lots of reordering of churches. So I'm coming across issues where human remains are being found or lost, often mostly lost, and what we do with them. And I'm also working with the churches to look at how we deal with those in the long and short term. I've got a background in church archaeology because my PhD is in later medieval funerary monuments in churches in Flintshire. My area is mostly northeast Wales.
And we've got John Lawson online.
Yeah, he is there, but for some reason we keep getting Mr. David Baker. David, we're so sorry. John.
Can you hear me, see me? I'm here. I can see you.
I hear you, John. Yeah,
okay.
Just carry on, John. We'll fix this now.
Yeah, John Lawson. I'm the Edinburgh Council's archaeological officer. I'll get a bit of reverb there. What do I do? I'm basically a regional archaeologist at City Council, but I'm also a museum curator. We have a large collection of human remains, and also I'm project officer of the Tram, so we've been digging them up over the last 20 years. And I would say I'm just about to do an exhibition in St Giles Cathedral, so church archaeology as well. So, yeah, been dealing with human remains for most of our career. And we also help out with the police in terms of call-off contracts for human remains, but that's the same for all regional archaeologists up here in Scotland. That's it.
Have Edinburgh?
No, she's not well.
Oh, okay. So this is a panel. So thank you, everyone. So one of the big reveals in the Human Remains Digital Library is a long history of grave goods being deposited, not only at the time of burial, but when someone was reburied or enshrined. As Jane mentioned in the first session, you know, it's a case of not just bodies being moved, but everything being moved around a church willy-nilly, or so it may seem. Or people, you know, sometimes people took items during exhumations for display, either in the church or as a private token. This information is incredibly ripe for further exploration, both in research and the way that we think about grave goods in modern church settings. What are your thoughts on this as spatial experts?
Do you want to have a look at some of the maps now?
Yeah.
Okay, probably just to introduce that question. One of the things I've been doing is trawling grey literature reports. Now, grey literature refers to these sort of little reports that come out once an excavation has been done, and the archaeologists will write it up and they'll put in there what they found, what the significance of it is, and then they usually forget to say what they're going to do with the stuff afterwards. So as part of the project, I've been looking at grave goods and where they've been found within the cathedral itself, and we've got some little maps that we've been playing with.
Give us a second. The battery died. She's just added to the list of things that have gone well today.
Okay.
But the library's still active.
Yeah.
One of the things that's really stood out is that in terms of archaeological objects, stuff that medieval individuals have been buried with, the notable folks are being buried with grave goods. Now, in a lot of circles, you know, the theology is, well, they're Christian, they don't need these objects and they don't need them in the afterlife. But what we're finding is that the textual evidence is saying, well, actually they do. These are important as status symbols and as objects for the afterlife. And the archaeology is showing that as well. So we've got this beautiful symmetry between text and archaeology. And all across the more liturgically sensitive areas of the cathedral, we're finding people being buried with the croziers and chalices and patens, gold and silver finger rings, and a lot of those are still surviving today. You know, the looting that went on in centuries past didn't get it all, so we're still finding stuff. And when the maps come up, we'll take a look at those in a little bit more detail.
Would you like to jump in, Alfred, or Sue?
Well, I mean,
Your experience.
it's easier when we have the map up. I mean, obviously, the way in which people use churches and engage with different spaces is incredibly important to both their development from a physical point of view, alongside the archaeology and everything else. So being able to track where all of these excavations have been and how people are actually engaging with these spaces within these different churches, and how that may be consistent or not consistent across regional areas and even local areas, is extremely useful. And the map itself can be expanded even further to not just look at the burials themselves, but funerary monuments and how they've moved over time and how that has altered the perception of both that individual and the space as a whole.
Hey.
Yay!
There we go.
Okay.
So James will explain the conceptual church map a little bit at the end. But essentially what we've been doing is mapping onto here where burials have been disturbed through different types of disturbance. So for example, this one shows burials disturbed through buildings or maintenance or groundwork. And we can start to see sort of hot spots in a typical cathedral where you're most likely to encounter this. Next one.
Next slide, Katie.
Yeah.
So with the controlled vocabulary, we've been really careful to make sure that when we're logging disturbance events, we're using the same consistent language. So building, maintenance and groundworks, grave digging, iconoclasm, we all use those sort of keywords. Again, we're not putting our own interpretations onto these things. We're using what the archaeologists have said. Now that may or may not be true, but we're not putting our sort of lens on this at the moment. So burials disturbed through grave digging in cathedrals. So there's an awful lot of intercutting, and this sort of gives us information about ethics and ethical treatment, that it's very normal in the past just to budge someone up or to chop through them to put somebody else in. But we can see, you know, places like the chapter house and the nave and the choir are hotspots for intercutting burials. There's a lot of bias in these maps, which we'll talk about later. And then the final one shows the grave goods. Just pop that one up.
Yeah, just give it a second.
Okay.
It's slow to load, that's all.
There we go. So we plotted the total number of grave goods discovered through 20th and 21st century archaeological excavations. And lo and behold, the chapter house comes out red hot. Lots of notable individuals being buried with chalices and patens. Places like Lincoln Cathedral, where in the 1950s they decided to go on the hunt for St. Hugh of Avalon because one of the vicars once saw a body missing its head. So what they decided to do was open up all of the graves in the chapter house and remove the chalices and patens, the objects, from the body into the cathedral library, but leave the bodies where they were. Now, discuss. But that's the sort of evidence we're logging. Again, we're not interpreting it. We're not putting our own judgment on it. We're just saying this is what's happened throughout history. But these maps give us temporal depth. They allow us to see changes in activity over long periods of time, which hopefully is useful to interpreting the buildings themselves.
I think from my point of view, one of the discussion points that I would have regarding this concept of the map and the logging is the type of church and So I'm looking at lots of very small Welsh rural churches. So we would work completely differently from what's going on across the border, let's say. And so I think that for me, that's interesting because we can plot those within our own network. So by creating a model that works for me, my little North East Welsh churches is quite different. Certainly when we look at what's going on in the Victorian period. So I have very little archaeological evidence, as in modern archaeological reports. But what I do have is lots of antiquarian evidence. So although that's quite different in its nature, so it's not talking in an archaeological point of view. When it talks about human remains, it'll just say they were reburied respectfully or some such. And I think so that is problematic in that sense. And the terminology is quite key. And again, going back to the previous session, linguistically, there's things going on that's quite different. So not only do you have the issue with language use, perhaps we're looking at Welsh, we're also looking at Cumricisation or actually even Anglicisation, all going on within a 100-year period. And that does make a key difference when it comes to the reports and the antiquarian records that we're looking at. And that does make a difference to what this map would look like, for me, say. So the concept is absolutely key when we're looking at the removal, as Alfred said before, about tombs, or whether we're looking at grave goods, or whether we're looking at funerary monuments. There is quite different to what's going on in the smaller, more rural churches than it is going on in scale. So that's why this again is very useful for me. If I'm going into a church that's looking at having a reordering done, and they're looking at, oh, I'm looking at the faculty plan that goes into the planning committee, I'm having to figure out, well, actually, you may tell me there's nothing there, but in actual fact, I know from looking at the antiquarian records that you've not seen that there is something there. And so really, your planning application needs to change quite dramatically. So that's where I would say from my point of view, looking at planning, that's why it's different for me.
And just to note, this is based on 42 cathedrals. It doesn't look at any parish churches. Now that would be a great project, wouldn't it, to bring in all the rest?
Yeah, I mean, it would look quite different from that. But I mean, again, it's the concept is absolutely key to what we're doing.
Thank you. John, would you like to jump in?
Can I just just give me a minute, John. Sorry. For those of you who are just attending and not speaking, can you please mute yourselves? We keep muting you and people are unmuting themselves and giving us a lot of feedback. So if you've been muted, could you please remain muted? That'd be really helpful for us. Thank you. Yeah, sorry, John.
No, fine. Yeah, I'm just staring at a small screen. So, yeah, I think it's quite a useful tool. I find it just because I'm going through this project with St Giles Cathedral at the moment, and it highlights. I don't want to say that your map is wrong, but it is. It's about, but the serious part is about data and how you actually enter it as a research tool. I think this is very important. I'm just looking at a series of burials that we dug up in the late 70s. Sorry, am I getting a bit of reverb? I don't know if it's the same for you. Back in the 70s, so there's an exhibition at St Giles Cathedral in a couple of months' time. So I'm looking at the grave goods again. And our report, which I was co-signatory to, I apologise, mentions a lot of finds. We got a lot of finds of minimum material because some of the graves were outside originally. But looking at the material, I think a lot more are actually grave goods. So we're looking at knives, but not recorded. It just seemed to be material, or it just so happened it was next to this, the pelvis or something. So I think what has struck me is a lot of finds that may not be seen as finds, like knives or beads and things that aren't seen as grave goods or recorded as grave goods in the actual archaeological reports, which is an issue, but it's also a good thing in one respect, because actually this map allows you to go back and actually look at the original material again, which is actually, because, well, I need to go and find it now in our stores, which will be fine. But I think it's a really good research tool, this.
Yeah, so in a lot of the reports, there are fragments of knives and beads and as grave goods in the archaeological report. So we're going by the interpretations that that the excavations are putting on it, rather than us looking at it and saying, well, actually, we're going to reassess these as grave goods. And this map, by the way, only includes things what we would call sort of ecclesiastical grave goods, so the chalices, patens, croziers, finger rings. So it's not buckles, it's not knives and things like that. We have got that all in the database, but that map's just specifically for things buried with priests and bishops.
I think that's probably the most important point to make, that this is a starting point for
Of
the
course.
people who are caring for these buildings. And so obviously if I apply this to Portsmouth or to any of the chapels in, or St. Peter's in the Tower, it's just having that information located within the church that is the first step that then allows us to interpret it and then get to those spatial reassessments. What hasn't been mentioned so far is that there is quite a lot of editability in the map, so it can be changed to be representative of a Welsh parish church or a royal peculiar, or etc., etc., etc.
Absolutely. And thank you very much. And in terms of whenever we talk about spatiality and working with space and mapping, we invariably come to the question of working with sources which are vague and fuzzy and are quite ambiguous in the information they provide. How much of a problem have these issues been for you when searching for archaeological data? And do you think the Hurdle Library has a contribution to make in this capacity?
Yeah, from my point of view, as looking at planning, definitely, because largely you're looking at a group of people who are putting planning applications together who have no concept of what they've got. So they understand it's a church and they just want to use it as a church, and perhaps a bit more community use, that kind of thing. But actually, this kind of facility helps them because it informs them about what they've got. They don't understand that there's human remains. Good example. I've got an asbestos report being done on a church next week, and the person who's done lots of asbestos reports on churches all over North Wales and Cheshire, and had never come across human remains before. And I think he has, he just didn't know what he's looking at. But I think that kind of thing, it can really inform us and inform them when it comes to planning on churches. So the idea of coming across either human remains or some kind of grave good is beyond them, and that grave good, they are disposing of them, or they are just giving them, and they're in stores. I'm sure a lot of you have come across the idea that there's a black bin bag full of bones in the. We've all come across that, where there's there's this bin bag. I've seen an oldie bag recently. There's a particular issue at the moment I have with churchyards, where I'm finding people burying in churchyards or spreading cremated remains in churchyards without permission, and they're just disposing of them. Well, from our point of view, it's disposing of, but for them, it's a ritual act, and it's very important to them. And so to have this kind of resource there available where we can track them, I've got no way of tracking that. Some of these churches have been sold off or in private hands, but locals are still sneaking in and burying people basically in somebody's garden. So if we can track those records and allow people to understand the broader picture of what we're looking at, and again, from a planning point of view, that is really key.
Thank you. Would you like to jump in? Have you got anything to say, Alfred?
Well, Adam's done far more of the gathering of data for this.
Yeah. What strikes me is that this can change entirely on the next excavation. And one of the challenges is going to be sort of making sure that we keep adding data and keep sort of refreshing this and keep making it available to those who are making the decisions.
Of course, the landscape changes with each and every dig.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder how the archaeological trusts would react. I've got a meeting actually on Monday with somebody who's working with a local trust, and I've broached the subject with him already, so we're primed to talk about it. So I wonder how they would feel. Maybe they would just feel as though it's an extra task on their workload, or whether I hope that they would embrace it. Because again, if I'm working across multiple churches, looking at planning permissions, and I'm not able to find an archaeological report, I know what to look for, as in I'll go to the archive, I know what to search for, perhaps I might come across it, I know where to go to if I'm in the church, where to find key records, but actually lots of people don't. So, and also I obviously you do miss things, and if we can track them as we can move through it and get some research into what's going on within churches across my region in particular, would be really useful. But we do need to get the archaeological trusts on board.
Yeah. John wants to jump in, sorry.
I was going to throw in, I suppose naively I would say that all medieval churches have got bodies underneath them, but that's just a the question is about records. I mean, I'm probably have to stick up for my local authority archaeologists. I know that this is our Scottish perspective up here. We have a slightly different systems. We don't have cathedral archaeologists for a start. But I was going to say the records of any modern excavation should be with the local authority archaeologists as well, but we might not. I mean, certainly, although church have exemptions for a lot of things. In Scotland, I suppose most of them seem to be Church of Scotland seem to be selling off most of their churches at the moment. So will have issues with disturbance of human remains or having human remains underneath people's floors, which is coming to light. But I suppose there's different risks. It's not waffling on a bit there, but for me, it's what was where we had a lot of disturbance in a lot of our churches in the Victorian period, certainly St Giles Cathedral, and we just there's a record of them moving 5 tons of human remains out in 1844. I've got no idea where they went. So I'd love to know that, but it might not be for this tool.
No, one of the perpetual problems that we've encountered is that there's usually no record of what happens to the bodies after they've been analysed. So because of the post-excavation process, there's often a bit of a lag time. So the report will come out and be published, and it may say something in the WSI like bones will be reburied at an appropriate location. And you think, well, where is that? There's a wonderful example from Ely Cathedral, I think it is, where a cemetery was excavated outside the cathedral and then reburied as a charnel, nice big charnel pit. And then some poor old soul about 5 years later came along and did an archaeological excavation in the same area and rediscovered the reburied charnel pit. So it's the kind of the bones that kept on coming out of the ground, and that's simply because of a lack of recording, a lack of information.
Yeah, that's exactly one of the churches I'm working with. I know I was told by somebody who was there at the time where, it's over there, the charnel is, but I'm not totally convinced that that's where it was. And I also, when we lifted the floor recently, we didn't find as big a scatter as we should have found. Where are they? So there are issues, especially when we're looking at intervention within churches. So we're looking at putting a floor heating in. So of course that will make a big difference as to where we now put them when we do find them. So that is an issue here.
I suppose, I mean, coming back to what do you think this problem is and how does the library help assist with that? Obviously, it's an issue. All of us who have worked with historic archaeological excavations knows that it is inconsistent at best, and even if you can find them. I think where this will begin to contribute meaningfully is in legacy, because yes, there are local archaeological advisors, not always. Sometimes those posts just disappear. Sometimes city archaeologists posts disappear. We haven't had one in Portsmouth for years. So it's, if we're able to actually start to condense this information and document it properly in a way which is easy to share with people who are not archaeologists, then I think it starts to create more of a legacy and an easier transition of information from us onwards, because we can realistically do almost nothing about the previous excavations. What we can do is try and form better practice as we move forward, and that's what the policy work that one of the spin-off bits of this is also looking at as well. So it's a start, and its evolution will be hopefully incredibly useful.
I think
dissemination is key, isn't it? Sorry, I'm sorry, John.
No, just to pick it up and say that if I can. Sorry for interrupting on our screen. I suppose a lot of these records should be within the local authorities' historic environment record, at least in some ways. So I see this tool it's a complementary. The slide is complementary to that. It's about record keeping. And there's lots of problems with archives, etc. So different. There's a different issue in England than is where I'm sitting up here in Scotland. But it's where did bodies go? I mean, we're the ones that have been excavated in Edinburgh by and large are within our museum collection. We've got permission to do that through law, but it's different in England. It's about reburial, or I mean, a lot of museums have archaeological, but where are they all? Is there? Could we have? It's how we actually highlight that. Sorry, on the local authority HER record for the site as well, which complements this. So that's really what I would say. It's how we actually move forward in that. If there's an issue about where human remains are in archiving, that's something that was maybe should be brought up, because there's no point going into a site and digging up something that's just out before.
But this is the problem, and even where the reports may have been archived, the actual physical archaeological archive, particularly in relation to English cathedrals, often just disappears or is taken by that archaeologist, and then they die, and their grandkids go, "What boxes of ceramic? I'm just going to throw these in the bin." And so it's
as an industry, we're working towards that, sorting that out.
I think that as well, if it is shared more widely, and we look at incorporating those people who are undertaking the work, i.e. the archaeological trusts, we encourage them, and that is a legacy in itself, isn't it? That's what we're after. We're after them. It's retraining them to think that that's part of what they do. I've looked at so many archaeological reports or surveys of churches before they're sold off, and it's unbelievable if you then walk around the church with the survey. And it's amazing what they miss, what's not there. They don't mention the bag of bones in the chancel. They don't talk about some of the monuments and the placements of them and significance of them in relation to where the remains have been found. And they're not discussing that. Well, why? Maybe because they don't feel as though they need to. Well, we just need to, it's about, again, that's about dissemination, isn't it? About telling them, and improving access is about improving interpretation.
Even applying this to the most basic level of a decommissioned church that has been bought and divided up for residential use, if something like this is available to the DAC and crucially someone is able to plug in that data, that advisory body, even if they're lacking in archaeological specific knowledge, will be able to go, there are things here we should probably talk to somebody about. And obviously that's years and years and years down the line where you've got somebody who's plugged all of that stuff in for that individual church, but it's the principle of this is brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you. We provided each of you some early access to the library. Hopefully, so you have a bit of a play about with the archaeological records. We looked at some that Adam made earlier during the live demo. How easy was it to find information on the grave goods? Did that work? So did the terminology that we have deployed, did that tie in with what you expected, and did it facilitate? Did it help you find what you may be looking for?
I think so. From my point of view, it will do. Yeah, I think that's what. Yeah. So in other words, the cathedrals there at the moment, you could walk around. Chester's probably the most familiar one. You could walk around the cathedral and you could envisage what we're looking at, and that's why it's useful for me. That's why it would be useful for me, and the kind of work that I do across the diocese is that allowing us to plot. Back to what I said earlier on about looking at planning permissions. Some churches have no concept because it's an 80-year-old warden that's writing the faculty, and so they don't understand the fact that no, we shouldn't really be digging through that grave. And actually, when we're looking at the known or the unknown dead, is that it's just a body. They're not making any emotional connection because they're so far removed from the original person or that the ritual that took place. They're so far removed from it that it doesn't mean anything anymore, or at least it means less anyway. So of course, unless we have a known person and we think, or at least we think we have a known person and a known burial, it means very, very little. So something like this would make a key difference. The architects, of course, they've got all their registrations, they understand the concept of the listed building, but actually for their point of view, again, they're not really seeing what we're seeing as an archaeologist. It's just a part of the process. We have to get the WSI in. The amount of times I've been asked to do a WSI, and I've had to explain that it doesn't work like that. I can't just rock up when you're digging your hole and tell you whether that's okay or not. The regulations there for a reason, and that's why this is really important, because this is easy to dissect and easy for other people to understand.
For those who are not sure what WSI is, it's a written scheme of investigation. So it's a document that's written before the trowel hits the soil, and it sets out, well, what will you do? Yeah, some are written retrospectively, but it says things like, what would you do if you encounter human remains, for example? What would be your plan?
They're quite prescriptive, aren't they?
Yeah.
In that way, it's quite prescriptive, but it's useful.
But I think the principle of just applying the text as it appears in those grey-letter reports is a good one, because, as I said earlier, it will be for subject specialists in that cathedral, in that area's burial rites, in anything else local about these churches, to go through and interrogate them to actually say, okay, is this knife a burial? Are we going to include buckles? How does that interpret the use of this space specifically within its local context? And so, yeah, I think the practical application of that and trying not to reinterpret everything in Hurdle is a good thing.
We want ease of use, don't we? We don't want something that's cumbersome, although people are going to use it. It has to be usable, and that's why I think that it's very simplistic in many ways, quite complex in others. So in other words, it's quite complex for me when I'm looking at, or most of us when we're looking at it from a research point of view, and what we can discover from it. But on the ground, it's quite simple in the ability to use, so somebody could quite easily access the information. It can't add more workload to the conservation officers that are working across the diocese, across the UK, because their workload is especially now when the church in England and Wales are desperate to not close any more churches, and so they want to make something useful. And a lot of the funding bodies that are looking at helping with reorderings are heritage based. So if they can have something on their fingertips that allows them to interpret what they see, it's got to be a good thing.
As the old adage goes, there's lies, there's damn lies and statistics, but we do find maps like this. We hope they will be useful in identifying the areas of where there's potentially areas of potential for richer finds, and that's been our aim.
The way that this has been set up is that you can look through the centuries, so you can look at temporal depth to see, well, what was happening in the 13th century, and how does that compare to the 15th or the 17th, and how does that inform practice today? Is what we're seeing changing over time? Is there one ethic, or are there multiple ethics that are in play across cathedrals? So it should be a really useful way to mine temporal depth within the church as well, to see how opinions and perspectives have changed over time.
I'm going to tie this back into the previous session again, if I may, with another question, especially as the names of specific places within institutions, within buildings, monuments, building development, and the significance of internal spaces. What's important? They have changed over time. We know this. How important is it to recognise this in your work, and how might Hurdle be used as supporting evidence to showcase this? Key thing for me.
I mean, as the buildings archaeologist masquerading as someone who knows anything about human remains, for me, it's probably the area where this becomes most problematic and where you need actual engagement with specialists on that building. Because, I mean, even going back to Portsmouth, even though it is a jumped up parish church acting like a cathedral, we have our 13th century north and south transepts. They are now a choir and a lady chapel. They're not called north and south transepts. And then we have 17th century north and south transepts. So on the one hand, looking at the grey lit and saying, okay, this says this dig is happening in the transept in this point. If you're not thinking about it too much and you just plug it into a generic plan of a church, then that will potentially go in entirely the wrong place, which would then skew everything. But I think that's just, by necessity, is going to have to be overcome by engaging with local experts and with people who understand Welsh churches, with people who understand Scottish churches and various other cathedrals. So it's problematic, but I think if used appropriately, and it will be able to help us to understand how the use of these spaces has changed as they have evolved and gotten bigger and then smaller and then bigger again.
Thank you. Susan, do you have anything to?
Similarly, if I'm working with a small single-aisled church, that that is quite different. Where the sanctuary is not anymore, and I think we have to understand the layers of the building and how that building has changed over time. I'm finding sort of small burials coming up under the north door, or this is quite a key thing that's happening. Whereas if you're looking at that building then being sold off to somebody else, I'm actually also finding lots of early cross markers or early Christian monuments found in blocking up doorways, and they are really quite key. And they're often lost in that survey that goes out when the building's about to be closed. So we need to inform that archaeologist, usually an archaeologist that's doing the surveys in the first instance, so that they know how to populate this kind of software. And that's quite key as well, so that we can understand the sort of regionality and the differences and what we're finding. So although that is a problem as such, it's easily overcome. It's understanding that the problem's there in the first place that's the issue.
And what about a Scottish perspective, John? With the changes over time, is this been a problem?
Just trying to think about it. It's about how you record it. I was just thinking back from St Giles. Well, technically, it's 900 years old, so there's almost nothing left of that early church, and certainly in situ. There's a doorway, but it's probably been moved. And that, for instance, the bodies that I'm dealing with for my project were essentially now located in the South Choir Aisle in your plan, but for the first 200 to 300 years they were external to the church, so they're actually in the graveyard. And the church you see today is extended out probably in the mid 14th century. So it's about how you record it. So do you record those burials being found in the South Choir? Technically, yes, but really they're actually found in the graveyard. So that's about how, getting back to the early conversations about, if you're populating something, it's about understanding it and it's cross-referenced the data correctly. Otherwise, it's the same for any archaeological project. So I think that's part of it. In terms of recording churches, well, I mean, we've got a problem with Church of Scotland selling off lots of the churches, but we have different burial regulations. So unless, well, shall we say, we've got lots of issues already, but they've got tighter controls that they start digging off in people's gardens. But yeah, to the new burial ground. Burial Act in 2016, but no, we have problems about redeveloping churches for private houses at the moment. That's going to be something that we're going to look forward to over the next couple of years, especially
having that specific legal knowledge is a universal problem, regardless of which border you're behind, and people who are buying churches because they're lovely, beautiful spaces and they want to put their house in them aren't necessarily going to go through all of the legal framework before putting a tree in there, what they conceive to be their garden. And so having something like this with...
That's an interesting... Well, they should go into buying a house. Really, effectively, there should be... if the church is post-1850, there shouldn't be any bodies in it. In Scotland anyway, and probably from the 18th century either. So, but if you got
it's something that everyone is going to universally understand.
I think the planning process is there for a reason, and the planning process should, she says, the planning process should cover all of these issues. In that, you look at planning applications that come through, whether it comes through the diocese or whether it comes through your local planning, it should all go through the same process. The CBA is there, the Council for British Archaeology is there to oversee that process. So it should, even if a retrospective application comes through, it should all go through that same process. Of course, there's always issues with that, but it's there down to the same regulatory bodies should all consult on that process. So that shouldn't happen. The issue is when an application comes through for change or for modification, when the archaeology is not recorded in the first instance, and that's the problem. Because if a survey is done by somebody who doesn't understand the concept of the type of church they're looking at, that does dictate then what goes from that point onwards. So that's the point, is that when it's sold or when the application goes through, it's what's already there in place. And so that's why this is useful. Although, of course, the problem of populating it is also a problem, is it in itself, isn't it? How do we populate it? How do we ensure that process doesn't get stuck when the application goes in?
No, we've had some really nice feedback in the chat at the moment on this session from Emily Lanigan-Palatoy, who most of you know for Chester Cathedral. She said, I totally agree with this discussion. The connection between the archaeological finds, archival records and other data and excavation and works in the present is extremely poor in English cathedrals. Likewise, current process of archiving material are subpar for future generations, which I think we've kind of been touching on, because we're kind of in a transition period. Having a starting point like Hurdle is helpful to incentivise people to add to this work. And then Michael Penman, again representing Scotland, very interesting for both England and Scotland, a model that might be further illustrated as a starting point for researchers and custodians is a timeline of phases to consider and connect with likely types of sources. So medieval disturbance, Reformation relocation, antiquarian interest, 17th and 19th century regulated so-called room or grave burial, church extension improvements, and 19th and 20th century utility disturbance. And it goes back to Adam, what we were talking about on the project. What you got at is that what's in the report and how they date things and finds is not necessarily the date in the reports.
No, and I think there's a little bit sometimes of what I would call the Boudica effect, where if, for example, if you're in Norfolk and somebody, metal detectorist, finds a coin hoard that's vaguely the same date as Boudica, it gets labelled as a Boudican event. And in cathedrals, I've noticed in a lot of archaeological reports is that if there's a grave that's been clearly rifled with or disturbed, and it dates after the end of the medieval period, but before the Victorian heating ducts went in, it will often, the little phrase will appear, iconoclasm.
No.
And it's like all of these different events, which may have great temporal depth, but on a very fine scale, get lumped to this one known event, which is the kind of the Boudica effect. And I think there's the Reformation effect or the Civil War effect that is happening. So the dating of these burials is difficult. And the archaeology, especially when you've got no grave goods and all you're doing is dating by phasing, of course, you can only give a broad date range. So on Hurdle, we have a broad date assigned to almost everything where we possibly can. But within that, the dating becomes increasingly difficult just because of lack of evidence.
I do love the Boudica effect, and that consolidation is such a good solid note to end on. I think this session, because we are exactly to time, wonderfully. So I'd just like to thank the panel once again for some really considered discussion, and some insights have been incredibly valuable. And I'm going to revoke, as Glenn did, my chair privileges and announce that the conceptual church map, which Adam uses as the base for his map, is now freely available on our GitHub. It's a free to use, open access geo package for any geological software. I will have my laptop and that running during lunch, and anyone who'd like to have a chat about it, please do come and have a look, and we hope that you might be able to make use of it in your own research. Thank you for that.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Another 15-minute break, and we'll start again at 12.